All right, good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues here at the Wilson Center and our partners on today's event at the Center for Climate and Security, it's my privilege to welcome you all to this morning's discussion on the story behind climate security. For those of you joining the Wilson Center for the first time, I'll say just a quick word about us. The Wilson Center was mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. We have about 15 programs that focus on different regions or topics. Together, we cover every corner of the globe in today's most pressing issues. I want to send a special thank you to our Africa program, our Polar Institute, and our Middle East program for their co-sponsorship of today's event. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, examines the connections between environmental and climate change, global health, and population dynamics, and explores the impacts of these trends on foreign policy, human security, and political stability. We are lucky to have a number of very smart allies in this space, and I want to thank our colleagues at the Center for Climate and Security for their partnership on today's event. So whether you're an old hand in the climate security space or new to the field and just starting to explore it, you're in the right place. Together, today's speakers bring a diverse view of climate security from various angles. Two of our panelists, Sherry Goodman and Peter Shortstein, have centered their careers on the cutting edge of climate security. Their work has helped inform efforts to better account for climate risks in policies, both in the US and abroad. They've both just published must-read books on the topic. I have them both here. So I hope you'll stick around after the event to pick up your copy of the book, get it autographed, and have a cup of coffee. We also have Assistant Secretary Ann Witkowski here, who brings critical insights from her role in conflict and stabilization operations, where climate impacts are increasingly central to diplomatic and security efforts. Her expertise is key to understanding how to apply a climate lens to practical policy implementation in volatile regions. And Marissa Kerma's deep understanding of the Middle East adds a crucial regional perspective, highlighting how climate security intersects with existing challenges in a region that is highly exposed to climate risk, that is grappling with conflict, and that plays host to a number of countries whose economies are built on supplying oil and gas to the world. So our goal with this event is to offer a multifaceted exploration of climate security from high-level policies to on-the-ground realities. Bios are available on the event page, so I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of their current titles and affiliations before we get started. Sherry Goodman is a Wilson Center Senior Fellow and Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate Security. Peter Shortstein is a veteran journalist who has reported from 30 countries and a global fellow here with the Wilson Center and a non-resident research fellow with the Center for Climate and Security. Ann Witkowski is the Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And finally, Marissa Kerma directs the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. Quick housekeeping notes. For those of you watching online, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat box below the video that you are watching at any point in the discussion, and we will try to get to those questions towards the end of the program. I'm thinking about if there's any other housekeeping issues. I don't think so. We will have time towards the end of the session for Q&A, so please, for those of you in the room, be thinking about your questions as well. Okay, so let's get started. Sherry, your book, Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, is a masterclass in navigating political process, multi-level negotiations, building trust between actors who see themselves as competing in similar spaces, and building pathways for action in areas that have traditionally been overlooked or underappreciated despite their importance. So our understanding of climate security has evolved rapidly, I'd say, over the last decade, and you've been part of that evolution. Can you walk us through that evolution and how you see it playing out today and where you hope to see it move forward in the future?
Well, thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you, Lauren, and the Wilson Center for organizing this event. You have really done a great job in your leadership at the Environmental Change and Security Program, and I want to thank you for that. I have a long affiliation and great fondness for the Wilson Center. I also want to give a shout out to Erin Sikorsky and the Center for Climate and Security. As co-author, Erin is another great leader in this space. So privileged to have her leadership here and the whole team from the Center for Climate and Security. And to my fellow panelists, my fellow co-author there, Peter. We've been toiling in the same seas now here for a while. And Marissa, I really appreciate your leadership at the Middle East Center here. And of course, Ann, your great leadership as well. So, you know, in this book, I try to bring a lot of threads together and put you in the room where some of these decisions have happened over the course of several decades. First in awareness on environmental security in the Department of Defense, and later into the climate era, and not only in the department, but across many agencies of the federal government, because it's a story partly of my own experiences, starting in the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee to the Department of Defense, and then a variety of interagency and think tank capacities since then. But it's the story of many other leaders in this space. And, you know, when we started, I'd say back in the 90s, there was, as you note, Lauren, you know, it wasn't a natural act for military leaders to think about environmental concerns, except as they were legally required, so that they wouldn't get penalized. But that era of sort of developing a response to meeting legal requirements, either for cleaning up bases or protecting endangered species, and then learning how you could do so in concert with the military mission, really morphed into the climate security area, where it is not about just the legal requirement, it's about the security requirement, because the security needs are so clear and obvious in this era. And now, 17 years since the first group of generals and admirals came together to assess the national security implications of climate change in 2007, where we coined the phrase threat multiplier, the title of the book. And we sat around a conference room back then. I mean, Peter has all these experiences in these very difficult places, you know, but my experience has mostly been like corralling people in the halls of different government institutions to try to change how people think and sort of mainstream these considerations into foreign policy and defense decision making. And some of that involves getting leaders' attention and building trust with them, because as we say, you can't surge trust, you have to build it over many years. So many of you who are here or listening online are in this space in one way or another. So if you're devoting your careers to this, building the relationships that matter, that you can rely on when you want to tackle the hard issue, sometimes this is important as the issue itself. And so everybody has different personal ways of doing that. And then also continuing to come back and find ways to make relevant in any context. In defense, it's always about the military mission. It's got to be relevant to the mission, okay? And that matters whether you're talking, you know, weapon systems or training or what have you. And in the State Department, USAID, other branches of government, the mission, of course, is different, but the diplomatic mission, the development mission, and then the integration across the whole, because we know that today, you know, none of this knows any boundaries. The climate is changing, accelerating faster than we can adapt to it, and that's why these resilience strategies that we're focused on today are so paramount, because that's the way we're going to help our own societies here at home. And the devastation we've seen just in the last week from Hurricane Helene, you know, unprecedented levels of destruction in areas that were maybe thought to be climate havens. And we know now that there are no climate havens anywhere. So that makes paramount the focus on building resilience, improving our predictive capabilities, and also the strength and importance of our allies and partners in everything that we do.
Thank you, Sherry. Peter, your book, The Heat and the Fury on the Front Lines of Climate Violence, Peter's book is like a mother's worst nightmare, basically, because it tracks over a decade of reporting in places that are hard to get to and oftentimes dangerous, which is really important for those of us in DC who are not able to get to those places, right? And I'd say it's as gripping as it is sobering. So one of the challenges of climate security has been to show decision makers what it is, why it matters, and just how pervasive it is, right? And you take us around, how many countries? 8, 9?
I think a good deal more than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to minimize it. You take us around a number of countries, showing how these different kinds of insecurity are playing out from the household level to the community to the country. And also how sometimes the localized conflict and tensions that we're seeing mount are actually the unintended consequences of countries that are actually trying to work together peacefully, right? So in the process of writing this book, this is a topic that you've been covering for a number of years. You've reported for Nat Geo, for the New York Times, for the New Security Beat, right? Did your understanding, when you sat down to look at the full portfolio, did your understanding of climate change and security change at all when you look at the whole thing together? So in the process of writing this book, and then what are some of the key insights that emerge when you sort of look at the depth and breadth of your reporting?
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to all of you. I have a few photos here, I think, to sort of try and illustrate a few of the points that I'll try and make. The short answer is yes. I mean, the more that I worked in this field, the kind of longer that I delved into it, the sort of more worried perhaps that I became. And in part of that, a large part of that is precisely because the more that I reported in sort of different kind of isolated, out-of-the-way parts of, for example, Syria and Sudan and Mali, the more I came to see that a lot of climate change's most debilitating and greatest impacts on violence are the ways in which it is sort of acting on other drivers of instability. And so what I've tried to do in this book is to show kind of how these issues are sort of building upon one another. And maybe I'll give you sort of three brief little stories to sort of try and illustrate that. The first, I was mostly a writer for Nat Geo, very much not a photographer, but I was fortunate to work with a lot of extremely talented colleagues who've just produced phenomenal work. I between about 2014 and 2017, I did a lot of work in parts of Iraq and Syria, sort of trying to illustrate how ISIS had profited from collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks. And I found that some of the greatest concentrations of ISIS recruitment came in these sort of peri-urban peripheries of Mosul. You had these villages that were relative to their kind of more peripheral, out-of-the-way village peers, relatively prosperous. But what they were not prosperous relative to were those of the kind of nearby Moslawis, the residents of the city of Mosul. And that's because as climate change bit with sort of ever greater intensity year after year, their sort of already weaker incomes, their already kind of struggling livelihoods crumbled that bit more, at the same time as those of the nearby urbanites kind of stagnated or in some instances sort of increased. So the already sort of yawning differential between kind of the haves and the have-nots was getting that bit bigger. And because they were sort of on the periphery of the city, they had an awareness of that gulf in a way that many of their kind of even poorer, kind of much less accessible counterparts didn't necessarily. And so when along came these rather sort of savvy ISIS recruiters in the kind of latter months of 2013 and early 2014, large number of these villagers were sort of only too keen to kind of seize upon those existing and deepening inequalities to rather devastating effect. A second one, I mean, if you're sort of new to this field but have perhaps heard anything about it, it is perhaps in the context of Syria. And I don't want to sort of rehash too much the sort of minutiae of this argument, which has, to my mind, sucked up much of the oxygen in the climate security space. But one of the nuances that I think is quite important to sort of get across is the ways in which climate change exacerbated very long-standing Syrian unhappiness with state corruption. So on my trips to sort of different parts of the country, many of the farmers that I've met have told me that they'd got kind of use in a very unhappy way to the kind of bribe-seeking demands that many agricultural and other officials had placed upon them since sort of time immemorial. But as drought set in 2008, and as it sort of replicated itself for sort of 3 or 4 consecutive years, these farmers' ability to deal with those kind of long-standing bribe-seeking demands diminished. So this is just an illustration of how climate can kind of reduce public tolerance for the kinds of corruption that unfortunately are rather pervasive. I mean, the book is sort of one long series of kind of human-oriented stories trying to tell many of these tales, but maybe I'll leave it at that point right now.
Thank you, Peter. So, Marissa, if we turn to the context of the Middle East and North Africa, I think climate security is a topic that has risen in prominence in the region. The UAE's hosting of COP28, they had a focus on climate and peace connections. Water is certainly a theme that carries through the region. We've talked about Backdraft here at the Wilson Center, the sort of unintended consequences of climate that doesn't have a conflict-sensitive lens. And so thinking about what a renewable energy transition means for countries who have been reliant on oil and gas for their GDPs. And of course, it's a region in the midst of a pretty severe conflict, right? So putting that all on the table, how do you see the climate and security connection playing out in the region? How do you see it being taken up or not by leaders in the region, so private sector as well as public sector? And is it possible to think productively about these issues in the current context?
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks for hosting this very important discussion and including the Middle East program. I think that we're seeing some progress, particularly with the GCC countries. You've already mentioned the UAE that not only hosted COP28, but has launched various initiatives. One that you named that, connecting climate change with peace and security. I think that's a very important one. But I think part of the challenge across the board, because the GCC does not represent the rest of the MENA region, is that, the GCC have the means. They have the capital to invest in a lot of these projects. And so if you look at what the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others are doing, they're all launching their initiatives focused on green energy, renewables, water management. The UAE just launched a few months ago a specific water management and plan. But they have capital. So they have the capital they can invest. The rest of the region does not necessarily have these resources. They're starting to think about these different challenges and the interconnectedness of these challenges, because as Peter mentions in his book, and of course Sherry as well, that this is seen as a threat multiplier. The underlying conditions in the Middle East very much make it an issue that requires the government to cross-pollinate across sectors. They don't have a choice, particularly when it comes to water, for example, because we're seeing water scarcity across the board. As you mentioned in your book, Peter, this is something that's impacting local communities that don't have any kind of communication channels with the central government. And so the way a lot of these governments are set up, where it's very much centralized in the capital, government services tend to become less effective as you move away from the capital, particularly in less urban centers, including in agri centers and rural areas. And we're seeing the effects of desertification. This is a region that also is hosting a very large number of refugees and internally displaced, whether it's from conflict or from natural disasters, as in the case of Morocco and Libya just a few months ago. And so, there are multiple challenges. A lot of these governments may have, presented national plans, but we're not really seeing all of that play out yet, because it's not linked the same way that it is linked here in the United States and Washington with security. I think it's more connected to economic security and economic prosperity. That's one of the reasons why it's part and parcel of the diversification plans that a lot of the GCC countries are rolling out. But I think there has to be a mind shift. And I know you mention a lot, Peter, of these great examples of civil society organizations working together on various challenges, whether it's EcoPeace Middle East, working on water. I think this is something that the United States and the US government and other organizations that are working in this space should support, because that's one way that you ensure community leaders are have a voice, they have a seat at the table, and that has to be part of the talking points from the U.S. government. Support these organizations. Yes, they are elevating challenges that you don't want to deal with right now because you have more pressing crises to deal with, and that's another thing. There's so many crises to manage at the same time. But elevate these voices, give them a platform, and don't deny them a seat at the table at the different COPs you're hosting, because we did see that in Egypt, and I think you've reported on that.
Yes.
Great, thank you, Marissa. So, and Marissa talks about the U.S. government's role, so it's a perfect pivot. I think we've seen a concerted effort under the Biden-Harris administration to really integrate climate and climate security across the sort of USG ecosystem. We just saw the publication of a new U.S. framework on climate resilience and security out of the White House. The Global Fragility Act is a key piece of your portfolio that is a landmark piece of legislation that aims to address the root causes of conflict and instability in fragile countries, sort of in new and innovative ways and more effective ways, hopefully. So can you talk to us about how, from where you're sitting, the climate security has been integrated into pieces of legislation like the Global Fragility Act and other priorities by the administration?
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting us. Thanks to my panelists for your insights already that we've heard to shape today's discussion. So let me take on three key points. One is the broader point of why the U.S. believes that national security requires addressing the growing impacts of the climate crisis and how we're going about that. How the broader interagency is now approaching climate security issues under the framework, and why we need to integrate our policy approaches to climate change and conflict prevention into stabilization, which is very much the work that I'm focused on. Why has the U.S. elevated climate security as a national security issue? I think we can see, particularly in my area of work, how climate has affected people. Research is showing that over 3.6 billion people live in areas that are highly susceptible to climate change, with more than 1 billion in regions experiencing fragility or conflict. Again, the area of focus of the bureau that I lead. And by altering the availability of critical resources, we've already discussed this, water, food, and land, climate change is leading to disputes that exacerbate regional instability and in cases can challenge U.S. interests as well. So we recognize that the U.S. has to integrate climate threats into our diplomatic and strategic frameworks and shift from our short-term responses to a more proactive strategic approach that will anticipate future challenges and considers implications for geopolitical stability. And that's why, as you mentioned, Lauren, we now have released, the White House has released the Climate Resilience and Security Framework that underscores the U.S. commitment to this approach. There are three pillars of action that, if I may, let me just go through those that guide the U.S. government's efforts to identify, invest in, and address climate security challenges. So first is assessing climate-related threats, which advocates for integrated advanced scientific research and data analysis to monitor and predict climate impacts on a global scale. This should enable a better early identification of national security risks and more timely and effective responses, very important to policymakers. The second, partnering for an integrated approach, highlights the importance of stronger collaboration among U.S. agencies and international partners. A coordinated approach will empower global partners to better manage us and with our global partners to better manage climate crises and help us to promote long-term stability and peace. And then the third one is investing in collective resilience, which is prioritizing long-term collaborative investments, which are aimed at strengthening national security by reducing vulnerabilities and mitigating economic losses due to climate impacts. And there are a series of steps that are advocated, including increasing climate finance in fragile states. So that brings me to my second point, which is how climate security requires an integrated response. Each federal government agency has unique capabilities and comparative advantages, and coordination is critical to efficiently and effectively meeting those needs. Similarly, partnerships have to extend to partners overseas at the national, regional, and local levels, civil society, the private sector, and the philanthropic and international organizations as well, of course, to more effectively employ resources and information to respond to these needs. So one way that we're doing this is through PREPARE, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. That's has us working to help more than 500 million people in developing countries adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change by 2030. That is led by the Department of State and USAID, and is implemented by some 20 federal agencies, scaling up in 22 to $2.3 billion to implement PREPARE. In a recognition, and speaking of COP, that we must build partnerships to these climate-induced security threats, we were engaged in an effort at the last COP to sign the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery, and Peace, which brings together the diplomatic, the defense, and the development communities around partners around common objectives. It also stresses important elements of the work that we do in the conflict prevention and stabilization area, local ownership, conflict-sensitive strategies, and collaboration across sectors for tailored and effective programs. And then getting to the final point that you flagged, the importance of the conflict and stabilization community integrating climate security work in close collaboration with climate partners. And that's what we do in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. We're working on addressing the second and third order effects on human security, advocating for conflict-sensitive approaches to climate policy and programming in fragile regions, and at the same time, climate considerations incorporated into conflict prevention and stabilization efforts. So one way that we're doing that is through the work that we have underway in the Global Fragility Act, which is our flagship initiative, where we are integrating interagency coordination for climate considerations into the work that we are doing under the Act and under the associated U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. What we're doing under that law and through the strategy is to seek to address the drivers of conflict and the drivers of violence in a number of countries: Haiti, Libya, Mozambique, Papua New Guinea, and across coastal West Africa. We have 10-year plans which specifically now address direct and indirect climate hazards, key vulnerabilities, and how those dynamics might further drive instability or conflict. So it recognizes, the strategy does and our plans do, the benefits of taking climate adaptation actions to help build long-term peace and stability. And this is a new way that we're putting these pieces together in the conflict prevention and stabilization communities. We are already taking some specific efforts that reflect the work and the plans. For example, to the points that were raised earlier, we're working to reduce farmer-herder conflict in one country, in Benin. We're taking early warning data and we're putting it into the hands of farmers and herders, working with local scientists and with local community members, working with those community members to ensure that they have a greater understanding of what that data is saying, and then, in addition, can work together to take the data and to take the necessary steps to work together and to improve communication between the two groups and related mediation that might be necessary in view of pending climate-induced effects. I think the point here is that we are recognizing that the climate crisis is not a future threat in our community. It's right here, and we need to work together to address it. We are working based on the framework, to then scale up our work. We will be writing our first ever internal climate security strategy that will be forthcoming, which will again reinforce the integration and the work together of these two communities. And of course, we do this work in collaboration with partners like those who are here on the panel with me and with all of you. And those contributions are vitally important as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. It's nice to hear sort of about this new muscle memory that's being built and institutionalized in important ways. I know you are going to have to duck out a little bit early because of another conflict. So if I could just ask a quick follow-up, which is sort of reflecting on the years of service that you have provided in this conflict prevention and stabilization space. How have you, from your perspective, how have you seen the space sort of take on these new and emerging risks and improve its sort of adaptability and flexibility when it comes to things like climate change? And are you optimistic about the future?
Oh, okay. Thanks for that question. So adjusting the way that the U.S. government does business can be a long-term endeavor, and I think we've talked about that here. I think that we've talked about here today. What I've seen in the last couple of years, especially in this present position, is an acceleration of the way that this work has really been integrated because of a now a common recognition of climate change as a threat multiplier. Mm-hmm. And I see that in my day-to-day work. It's expressed through the new White House framework. It's expressed through the law, the Global Fragility Act, and the work that we have underway as a result of the act. And with these laws and policies, we are able then to work across the government to bring together communities for different reasons to be able to implement these changes, and we're beginning to see some of that. So can I give you just a couple of specific examples? I gave you one. We are now an investor in UN multi-donor data fund. It's called the Complex Risk Analytic Fund. And this brings together investments from a number of different countries and invests in different types of data that are relevant to conflict and crisis response. And one of the things that we've done recently with this fund at the UN is to contribute some $4 million to about 6 new projects that are focused on analyzing climate-related instability risks. And that marks the largest investment to date, as far as we know, in that kind of climate fragility data. So climate migration data and other kinds of related information that we hope will underpin better kinds of decisions by policymakers, recognizing the common information that we will now receive. We are also undertaking plans for specific types of programs that more intentionally recognize where climate and conflict or instability intersect. So, for example, for a number of years, we had a program in Mozambique that has helped to provide opportunities for climate-sensitive agriculture along the coast. And right now, under the Global Fragility Act, we are working with a particular focus in the northern part of Mozambique, which has experienced particular instability as a result of the incursion of violent extremist organizations. So we took that program, our post took that program, which has been in place, and has extended it further to the north. These are small steps, but one at a time, I think they will really add up to the kinds of change that that we need to see and that we're mandated to see under the new, under our law, the Global Fragility Act that we're implementing, but also under this new White House framework. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And thanks for being here with us today in the midst of, I know, is a very busy week. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Lauren.
Please join me in thanking Anne, and we're going to let her leave. Thanks. And I think that, Anne raises a good point about the, sort of specific tools that can be used in particular contexts. And this comes out in your book, Peter. You talk about the where you have seen the most positive impact are on sort of very local level responses, right? I'm going to try to weave like 3 different questions into one for the panel here.
Ready.
So bear with me. I think one of the things we think about in the climate security space is sort of, well, not just the climate security space, I would say in a lot of different relevant foreign policy spaces, is workforce development, right? And how do we ensure that we are investing in the education and the tools and the professional development of a workforce that is prepared to meet the challenges of the coming decades. And climate is a big piece of that, and we have had a number of conversations about the importance of climate literacy among the U.S. government and other governments, among civil society, the private sector. And you know, Sherry, you have sort of been educating a generation of decision makers in this space. And so for you, my question would be, what can we be doing differently or more of in order to make sure that we have a workforce that is prepared to meet the challenges ahead? So hold on to that for 1 second. And then, Peter, I think if you could share with us some of the most impactful efforts that you saw in your reporting. And I mean, I remember things like the use of sort of radio, right, and sort of satellite sharing of information around weather patterns so that pastoralists could make better decisions about where to go, for example, right? But sort of what are those low-cost, low-hanging fruit ways that outside supporters can be helping local communities grapple with these challenges? And then, Marissa, I just know from your work, you've spent a lot of time thinking about workforce development in the MENA region, particularly around women.
And youth.
And youth, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I will leave it there. And then, Anne, if you want to chime in, you are welcome to as well. Okay, Sherry, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you so much. Great questions. So on workforce development, first of all, I'll give a shout out to Caroline Baxter, because she led the work in the Department of Defense on a climate literate workforce. And I think that is a model for how to get started and deepen efforts in this area. I think it can be, there's obviously more that can be done even within the Department of Defense to make climate relevant at every level. It's not just about having the climate expert in an office. You don't want it siloed. So how is it relevant to your mission if you're in logistics, if you're in training, if you're in R&D, whatever echelon and whatever specialty you're in, it has to be made relevant, particularly for our civil affairs officers, our engagement teams, and at the combatant commands, where, for example, I think some of the efforts that are highly relevant are the scenarios and the exercises. Erin and the CCS team and others are doing a really good job of bringing that, and the department itself is, on an interagency basis. Those also have to be made relevant. So, and I think as we move on in this space, it's not only about doing it with people in government service, but it's about including and involving the relevant stakeholders and community leaders. I mean, to give an analogy from another era, when I came into the Department of Defense in the 1990s, we were being highly criticized for failing to clean up a lot of Superfund sites at military bases. And one of the ways that we sort of improved DoD's responsiveness not only was on the technologies and the actual cleanup of the bases, but was engaging and partnering with stakeholders in the community and making sure they were empowered. So we had what we would call citizen advisory boards at every base, with a co-chair from the community and from the base. Not just the base saying to the community, this is what we're doing for you, but actually being involved in the decisions. We call them restoration advisory boards. So it's that model of engaged and empowered sort of citizen participation at the right local level. And as we deepen the engagement that we have through these different frameworks, the new framework, the different things happening in CSO and the Global Fragility Act and other programs, prepares, et cetera, I think there's opportunity to sort of improve the engagement and the training, and then also learn from those who, as Peter's book shows, are on the front lines of experiencing this in their own community.
That's great. Thank you, Sherry. And I was corrected. Anna's not leaving. So just by any chance we have to applaud those working hard at state, we welcome those opportunities. So thank you for making extra time to be with us this morning. Peter.
Thank you. I mean, my book, as you can attest, is by and large quite a dispiriting read. But I do try and, so I do consequently sort of welcome any opportunity to sort of come out with some of the kind of related solutions that are out there. And part of it is there's this kind of narrative that's perhaps taken on, and perhaps people like me are in part responsible for perpetuating it, this sort of idea that there's this kind of thin veneer of civilization kind of separating us from this sort of, I don't know, Hobbesian, Lord of the Flies-esque war of all against all. But what I've found rather striking in many of the conflict climate settings that I work in is that there's not considerably more violence than there actually is. And the takeaway from that is that if you grant people the tools and the mechanisms to actually resolve their difficulties, no matter how much circumstances are sort of pitching them against one another, no matter how much officials are often pitching them against one another, then they will often seize upon them. So, I mean, a few of those tools. One of the biggest things that's happening from a climate security perspective is that the kind of slow collapse of, well, sometimes not so slow collapse of agriculture in many kind of rural parts of Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, is contributing to pretty extraordinary rates of outmigration. And among the first to leave are often the best and the brightest, among those who are kind of the leading local lights. And many of them are often absolutely instrumental in kind of local conflict resolution mechanisms. And as a consequence, as these sort of ever more intense climate stresses strike, a lot of these communities no longer have kind of recourse to turn to the kind of the kind of bodies of kind of local elders who previously would have kind of resolved many of the disputes that most naturally and most frequently arise out of these times of crisis. So some of the most striking and most important interventions that I've seen, particularly in the Sahel, have centered on civil society organizations sort of stepping in and kind of either rebuilding or building from the ground up kind of mediation bodies that have simply collapsed in large part due to intensifying climate stresses. A lot of the time, so when we talk about climate-related security risks, it's almost always a marriage of, kind of a very unhappy marriage of climate stresses and poor quality governance. And so given the difficulty, particularly at the level of many of these sort of poorer countries with their insufficient budgets, is there's a temptation to say, well, we need to bolster governance. But that is much, much more easily said than done, not least when you are a kind of a Niger, a Burkina Faso, a Mali, and you lack the resources in the first place to hire sufficient able administrators. I mean, I think Niger has something like 8 civil servants per 100,000 citizens, which is about a 30th of the number that France, its former colonial master, has. And that already insufficient number of administrators is sort of mostly centered, of course, in the kind of main urban centers where there's greater degrees of prosperity, there's superior degrees of safety, and hence greater attractiveness to being based there. So sometimes kind of solutions, kind of what constitutes something of a solution, is as simple as just directing kind of targeted assistance in such a way as to ensure that these states can hire relevant people to work in certain positions. But really, I mean, I know you didn't ask about sort of solutions per se when it comes to sort of reining it in, but not to sort of sound like too much of a broken record, it's really kind of meaningful global climate action alone that is a way of dealing with this. I mean, as Anne mentioned, we already have about 1 billion people who live in circumstances kind of beyond that kind of ideal niche, beyond that kind of ideal series of conditions that have kind of served humanity so well. As warming progressively worsens, it's only a matter of time in that kind of business as usual type situation till we have 3 billion people living in circumstances where agriculture, as we know it, is no longer viable, conditions in which rainfall patterns, which are already out of whack, are that bit less viable for communities. So yeah, to beat that dead horse for a moment.
That's fine, thank you. Marissa.
Yes, thank you. Before I get into the workforce development challenge in the region and how that all plays out, I do want to comment on two things that Sherry and Peter talked about. Well, first, in terms of governance, I mean, there are huge governance challenges across the MENA region. And, you know, there are some governments that are working on decentralization that would help. But again, a lot of these systems are very much, I mean, they're first of all authoritarian, you know, governments. So it's very much top down. And so these local solutions that Peter was talking about and the local engagement is not happening from the government level. It's happening primarily actually through international donors, the donor community, and most of the time, unfortunately, it's when crises hit. And so it's very much driven through that lens. It's not preventative. And the ability of a lot of these local communities to sort of come together, I think they do come together. They have their own fora that they've established, but they don't have the ability to maybe run NGOs or civil society organizations. So I've done a lot of hiking in Jordan, and it was fascinating just sitting with some of the Bedouin communities in the south, where they first of all talk about not trusting the government because they don't think that it will provide them with any solutions to some of the challenges. And of course, they're seeing desertification. They're seeing, they're experiencing all of these challenges firsthand. But then they had a few stories about how their local tribal leaders came together to address some of these problems, where there was some conflict between, you know, two different communities. Those tribal leaders came together to talk about it. So I thought that is fascinating. But of course, it's not the only way forward because we do need to strengthen governance systems. Now, when it comes to the workforce, and I think you do have elements of workforce development in a lot of these diversification plans, you know, it's Vision 2030 or 2035. I mean, every GCC country has them, as well as countries in the Levant and North Africa. But the challenge remains, twofold. First of all, when you look at the demographics, it's a very young population. Birth rates continue to be very, very high. Secondly, on the workforce formula and the way that we've approached it at the Middle East program is looking at both supply and demand, the education system and the private sector, the economy. And there's a huge skills gap. And so while some governments are trying to, reform curricula, change curricula, advance curricula to look at things like entrepreneurship, technology, and tech skills, the green job component is still missing. It's still not there. There has to be a lot of work done to bridge that gap. But I think the window of opportunity here is, again, actually, first of all, assessing where youth stand on some of these issues, because they are part of a generation that is very well connected. They see the Gretas, you know, of our world, and some of them are very much, driven to be part of these solutions. But it's what outlets, you know, where do we go with some of these ideas? The United Arab Emirates, for example, has, when it comes to technology and AI, they have this initiative to train 1 million coders, which is fantastic. Now let's try to also connect it to some of the other environmental challenges that we see across the region. And so, yeah, there's the skills gap is a major component of this. And so far, reform is very slow, particularly on the education side, and job creation in the Levant, where many countries are either close to being failed states or are in conflict, and we can look at that. Similarly, in North Africa, this remains a huge challenge moving forward, particularly as we see, the basic premise of this connection between climate and security is that climate challenges are a threat multiplier. So it's a conducive environment for, unfortunately, for more conflict if some of these issues are not addressed.
Good point. Thank you. And did you want to add anything?
I could just add something from the U.S. government perspective, and I would say that in terms of this question about skills or the way that we are doing our business, we have to think about this on, if you look at it from a U.S. government perspective, on multiple levels. And Sherry touched on a little bit of this, but first we have the piece that involves partnering across the U.S. government and bringing the various communities together. And there is, we now have a framework, and there's a will and an understanding that this is absolutely necessary. And then the second is the partnership with others who are from the donor community who also recognize this intersection, whether those be bilateral partners or on a multilateral level. The third, I would say, talked about governments, and that is the partnership with governments is absolutely vital. And then at the fourth level, or maybe fourth or fifth, with host communities, so that we do foster locally led solutions, and that also involves important work with civil society, with those who also are working particularly with the host community. So it's there's a multi-layered undertaking that's required here, and also a complex array of issues. Governance has already been mentioned, and I would add to that just a couple of additional factors. Inclusive economic development. We already talked about the youth bulge, having jobs and employment for women and for youth, and in places where there is instability, accountable security. Whether that's on the military side.
Can you explain what accountable security means?
Yeah, and building forces that are responsive and working with local populations in ways that are contributing to the security of those communities, and not driving instability by their practices. So there are multiple factors in play here, and what we are thinking about, what we are doing, is integrating the climate-induced impacts to those factors. That's what we must do. So I don't think we should underestimate the challenge or underestimate the opportunity that we have, recognizing what we're talking about here today.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Marissa, you mentioned demographics, and that is, Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel. And I'm going to put Peter on the spot because I was like 2/3 through his book when I realized I hadn't heard from any women yet. And I understood inherently that was a byproduct of where you were reporting from and your access to be able to talk to women and their access to be able to talk to you, right? But recognizing that a lot of these places are places where portions of the population lack access to essential services, right? Whether it's sexual and reproductive health or education, sending girls to school. So I wonder if you might sort of comment on how you thought about your reporting through a gender lens and what kind of emerged from that piece of the reporting.
So, I mean, you quite correctly point out that is a rather notable omission in much of the book, and I mean, as sort of Marissa kind of gave a sort of a grunt of recognition. I mean, the very act of kind of seeking out or perhaps even actively trying to speak to women in some particularly socially conservative communities in parts of sub-Saharan Africa in particular can bring on all sorts of possible trouble. But it's a particular problem, and it's a particular shame, because even just looking at it within this sort of niche-ish climate security field, or progressively less niche, we know that kind of climate change is contributing to particularly intense forms of violence against women, and not just in poorer parts of the world. I mean, I've had this ongoing series of focus groups in Athens, Greece, where I live, looking at the ways in which intensifying heat is contributing to much greater degrees of violence against women. Now, there's a wealth of anecdotal evidence to support this narrative, including in this country. There was a big uptick in calls to women's shelters in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl in the Houston area in June, July. And the precise mechanism by which extreme heat and other climate stresses is contributing to worse gender-based violence remains somewhat disputed. But yeah, both in our own cities and in many of the sort of poorer, particularly troubled communities in which I mostly work, it's almost invariably women who suffer most and suffer first.
Yeah, and are harder to include in the conversation in meaningful ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, across the MENA region, and I think, of course, it's not all one monolithic region. There are, variances across. But increasingly, societies have become more and more conservative, and women are not in the public sphere. They're mostly in the private sphere. They're the, primary caretakers, and that's why they're not talking to Peter. If you took me on those trips, we would have had conversations with a lot of these women. But yeah, this is a challenge moving forward because again, it's the how to talk to partners in the region, governments, about the interconnectedness of all of these different challenges. The gender challenge, the woman factor, the youth factor, the climate factor, and then you add on all of the other challenges that these communities are facing. But I think, again, I want to go back to the importance of empowering local leaders and local voices. And I love, what Sherry mentioned about citizen engagement in these committees. I mean, I saw this firsthand at the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, where, UN agencies came in with others and just set up shop, set up what they know how to do best. But then, the girls were not attending school. The way that they were using water, which UNICEF provides, was also all over the place. They were in fact complaining that there isn't enough water. And then they started setting up these local councils. They asked these communities to choose the leaders themselves, and they brought them together, and slowly the messages started filtering through the communities. And then you see signs across the different districts of the camp of, how to conserve water. Let's remind ourselves that we are in a water scarce country. And then similarly, when it comes to girls attending schools, you saw an uptick in that as well. So that is very important, particularly in these settings.
That's great, thank you. I want to open the floor for questions and see if we have any from the online audience as well. So I'm not checking my text messages. I'm looking to see what questions are online. And actually, I'm going to ask Angus, when we come to the online questions, I'll just ask you to ask a few of them of the panel. So please go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. And when we come to you with the mic, please share your name and your affiliation if you have one. We'll start here with Megan.
Thank you. I'm Megan Parker with the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. Lauren, earlier you mentioned Backdraft, which was a report I worked on while I was here at the Center with the Environmental Change and Security Program, and that Peter mentions in his book. And I think, and some incredible examples of how, how climate adaptation and mitigation efforts can inadvertently spark conflict. But I'm interested in sort of the inverse of that. What happens when you have efforts to resolve, to build peace, to do conflict resolution that maybe have negative impacts on the environment, on climate change? Can you climate-proof those peace-building or conflict resolution programs? And it's hard for me to think of an example, so I'm curious if anybody has one. The best one that springs to my mind is trade. Trade is a way that people build, helps build peace between countries, but it can have extraordinarily negative impacts on the environment and climate. So that's a question if there is some, examples in both of incidences of that and how to prevent it. And then the second question is mainly for Peter about storytelling. One of the things that I love about storytelling is that it allows you to convey very complicated ideas, very complicated people in a way that can be very hard to do in a more elevated policy context. But journalism itself suffers from the same silos, the same beat limitations that we see in government and other things. But you're one of a handful of journalists that are covering this both environment and security intersection. What do you think is needed to expand that, to have more than just
Money,
a couple?
Megan.
Well, money, of course. Yes, it's always money, right? But
Great. Okay, thank you. I think there was another question in the gentleman second row down here in the brown sweater. We'll get to everybody, so that's fine. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Omer Naeem. I'm with the Stimson Center. I just wanted to thank all the speakers for their incredibly insightful comments. So as a young American, I feel like there's a large recognition, awareness, and propensity to work towards building a sustainable global future. My question is, how can we build meaningful dialogues on climate security when there is a great level of civilian global distrust of the U.S. and simultaneously a lack of formal recognition for the U.S.'s role in exacerbating climate change?
Great question. Thank you. So let's start with the reverse backdraft. Just draft, I guess. The sort of climate proofing peace building, or not necessarily peace building, right? Sort of could go broader, but like how do we climate proof the things that tie us together? Does anybody want to take that on?
I have a sort of half-formed thought on that.
Bring it. Yep.
I mean, maybe I can sort of really try and address the second question, but this, to my mind, is a sort of illustration of what's particularly intractable looking about climate change. It's that take a look at the situation in Western North Carolina right now. At the same time as authorities are trying to distribute assistance that's necessary on account of this kind of climate-related intense hurricane, the very same bits of infrastructure, the roads and bridges that one needs in order to kind of effectively deploy that aid, have been shattered by the very same series of stresses. And so, this to me just sort of illustrates once more, the absolute necessity of climate change, climate action, because the more that these stresses and shocks spiral, the more that it kind of strikes our capacity to even kind of manage some of the lesser fallouts. As to, you're very obviously preaching to the converted on the storytelling front, and I would argue that that's even truer of the climate security space than it is of other ones, in part because it's really quite difficult to kind of effectively convey quite how climate changes are bleeding into violence. Secondly, this concept backdraft that you invoked, like looking at some of the kind of some of the violence or other troubles that can emerge from poorly conceived or ineffectively implemented climate action in the first place, it's quite hard to kind of spell that out without kind of simultaneously suggesting that climate action itself is a potential negative. But one of the problems is that I argue that kind of media is, in its current guise at least, quite ill-suited towards telling these stories. Like, even if you're writing or producing a news spot in a kind of pithy, concise manner, a lot of the time you're not granted the word counts that you need to kind of fully articulate the nature of the relationship. A lot of the time, you just don't have kind of, smoking guns. And to my mind, this is one of the many reasons why we still, as a sort of global community, don't fully appreciate quite how much violence climate change is fueling. And it's because it requires this kind of nitty-gritty, long kind of series of investigative trips on the ground to truly sort of unravel the manner in which climate change is acting on these other drivers of instability. And that's a kind of series of talking points and bits of evidence that can come across as rather anecdotal and doesn't necessarily carry the same kind of weight in the eyes of officials, in the eyes of some scientists, as sort of big statistical models might. So no, storytelling is vital, but we're up to a point, a victim of the lack of seriousness that approach still carries in the eyes of some people in positions of authority.
If I could just comment on that, I love Peter's storytelling in his book, and Megan, you've worked very hard to make scientists better storytellers, and I worked very hard in my own book to sort of make it more of a storytelling book than just an analytic treatise, the way I was more often trained, and definitely not a legal treatise.
Thank you.
And it's often not a natural act for people who are more analytically or scientifically or otherwise rigorously trained to do that storytelling. So this integration and multidisciplinary approach is important. And I also think the trend that we've seen in recent years, as an example, in the media, now you have meteorologists who, thanks to Climate Central and some others, have better weather reporting that includes climate. And it's so front and center in today's world, right, with hurricane, every successive storm, flood, fire. But I think there's going to be room in the future to do more of what, like Peter's book does. It is a wider lens on the climate security impacts globally, whether that comes out in the meteorology part of it or in other types of media. I've worked hard, I straddle kind of in my book for mainstream media sort of straddles environment and national security. So which one is it? Which is it going to be, the environmental reporter or the national security and defense reporter? And I'm trying to ideally get both or figure out how to get them to connect the dots and increasingly cultivate sort of the next generation of reporter who wants to see those dots. So, for example, I just did a spot which will run this weekend on PBS News Weekend with Ali Rogan, who's a correspondent there, who is a foreign policy journalist, but also interested in environment. So I think, hopefully the work that this community is doing will also help grow that next generation of journalistic talent. On the response to your other question about the unintended consequences, I think we have to look very hard at how we're now working to improve the global supply chain for clean energy. I know, something the Wilson Center is looking at, because there are those unintended consequences and others as well, in sort of improving our mining, processing of lithium, cobalt, all those rare minerals.
Sherry, I thought your book was really interesting in the telling the story behind a lot of the policies that we've seen come through. And for me, that was really valuable. I think I had the big picture, but understanding just like the exact levers, like who was in that position at the time, who was able to make the case to the target audience, right? I think that's an important story that doesn't get told as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Anne.
Yeah, thanks. Building on the great comments already, and to underscore something that Sherry just said, I think in the bringing together of these two communities, building an understanding of a common language. What are we actually each saying, and what are the terms that are very specific to our respective communities, so that we can work better together? And that will happen over time. It is happening, and will happen more over time. To the point about avoiding action that will exacerbate conflict. I think, just to underscore, this is why it's so important that we, as a policy matter, build in what we would call conflict-sensitive approaches at the front end to the climate adaptation work that we are doing, and that's a place where we can have impact, because it's a prevention. It's prevention to the point that was already made. When you're in the response phase, maybe it's a little bit too late. But what we can do to impact on the prevention side, I think, is perhaps an area where we can usefully focus and really make a difference. And it is really important. I think you'll start to see that happen more and more. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The other question was around civilian distrust and the lack of formal recognition of the U.S.'s role in emissions, which I don't know if there's a real lack of formal recognition. I think that's a work in progress. But on the civilian distrust piece, ties into a question I wanted to ask about misinformation and disinformation, which I think comes out in both of your books. But I wonder, I don't know where we want to start. Sherry, maybe we start with you on overcoming civilian distrust in sort of state governance, right? And overcoming sort of the prevalence of mis and disinformation that we're seeing, and how do you think it's affecting the climate security space?
Well, I mean, the good news is I think that uniform military of all services are still more highly respected in society, as at least in the United States. But I don't think that solves the mis and disinformation problem, which is just, getting worse in society overall, and I expect that to continue. So that's why climate literacy is so important, and it's important to respond quickly when all of that, as an example, when the story about the rain, the flooding in the very bad rainfall in the UAE some months ago, and there was quickly a story about how the U.S. or the West sort of did something, intervened to cause that, right? So getting that out there, you have to have it's like the Oppo group has to be there all the time to respond, although that probably in itself won't be enough. I do think, in answer to the gentleman's question in the back, how do you come sort of overall global, distrust of either the U.S. or the West in general in these spaces? I think this is a problematic long-term trend. I mean, we've probably left the American century, which was the last one, and we have to realize that we do live in a much more multipolar world where the U.S. is not going to determine outcomes in many regional conflicts. Think about the Middle East today. And so we're one, but we're only one or, with others. And so being humble and then building that trust and recognizing that it has to work with citizens and other allies and partners and institutions. And unfortunately, we have some very weak, global institutions at certain levels. So there isn't any good answer other than that you have to sort of, by being responsive and listening and being in the right places, I think can help create some of that trust that's not available at the institutional level.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, to flesh out a little bit more the misinformation and disinformation level, I mean, I began by talking about how climate change is sort of, merging and intermingling with other drivers of instability. And this is as true in the misinformation and disinformation space as it is in the kind of areas of corruption and inequality. I mean, an example or two, I mean, I found that in a lot of the work that I did in Iraq and Syria, kind of trying to flesh out how ISIS had sort of profited from collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks, there were quite a few instances where these, I mean, very unfortunately savvy ISIS recruiters had cast climate conditions as the kind of deliberate actions of, to their mind, nefarious actors. So, for example, in the Tikrit area of Salahadin in central Iraq, found that kind of a number of ISIS recruiters had presented the lack of rain as being a consequence of cloud seeding in neighboring Iran. The idea being to kind of deflect in this sort of predominantly Sunni part of the country, blame towards the kind of Shia majority neighbor next door. Equally, a number of instances where ISIS recruiters had convinced locals that the very fact that kind of nearby irrigation canals had run dry was a consequence of the sort of Shia majority-led government in Baghdad kind of redirecting canal flow towards their own constituencies, rather than the very fact that there was insufficient water to go around in general, and that the kind of Shia majority villages in the south of Iraq were, if anything, in a worse kind of condition. So this is an issue that's sort of permeating the climate security field, as I said, as much as it is elsewhere. And just to add to a point that was made, I mean, the kind of two-tier degrees of kind of climate action that we're seeing globally is certainly a massive threat from a Western perspective. It's feeding. I mean, even if the degree of climate action that we're seeing remains sort of grossly insufficient in richer countries relative to what's necessary, it's a good deal greater than what we're seeing in a lot of poor places. And given that there is a kind of a pretty strong understanding that kind of the emissions that kind of underlay much of this problem are an almost entirely rich country phenomenon, this is bleeding into the kind of anti-West sentiment that kind of governments in North America and Europe and parts of East Asia better reckon with if they're to deal with the consequences down the line. This is a kind of a brewing storm.
So I think just to zoom into the global perceptions of the United States and why that matters, I think it matters very much. I don't think all decision makers necessarily weigh it the same way. But I think we also need to look at the nuances when we look at this criticism and these, let's say, anti-Western sentiments, because they're very much driven by national security and geopolitics, less so on other issues concerning the economy or even climate security. And it's very much driven by the events of the moment. And we see the trends. You know, things calm down a little bit. You see more higher favorability ratings of the United States when things are relatively calm. And then when you have active wars, conflict, then these anti-Western sentiments elevate further. So that's important to recognize. I think that part of the story that sometimes does not get captured in these global surveys that are conducted is, well, what do people think about the United States as an economy or the United States as a people? And that's where you see variances. Because when it comes to the MENA region, when you look at various surveys about where would you prefer to migrate, and by the way, the vast majority of young people want to migrate for various reasons. Very high numbers from across the Middle East, less so the GCC. They don't name China or Russia, the two other great powers that are, very much present in the region. They all say we want to go to the United States and Europe because there is this admiration for American society, American entrepreneurship, American innovation, technologies, and being part of a society that perhaps could give you something. But those are not captured, particularly in times of conflict. But that's, going back to your point, Sherry, this is where the opportunity lies to actually engage people, in a more broader way. But also I agree with Peter that, these anti-Western sentiments that are very much based on decisions being made in these various conflicts, and this is very active now in the Middle East when it comes to Gaza and now Lebanon, these have to be reckoned with at some point because you cannot just focus on, AID remains to be the largest donor to this project or this community and that community. They're gonna, people are gonna say, great, but what else are you doing in terms of changing your foreign policy approach towards our people? But this is a very, I think, dangerous rift, and that is exacerbated by both misinformation and disinformation, which, when you put it on top of all the existing challenges in education, the way the media runs, how social media is, being used by, various actors, then it becomes even more problematic.
Do you want to weigh in?
Thanks. Just a couple of points. Misinformation, disinformation, as has already been observed, is a challenge, and you have identified one additional aspect of that challenge. And just to add to the comments that have already been made, this is this is an area that we are focused on, and we need to focus on as we go forward in this particular space. One way to address it in the context of local communities is lifting up local voices and amplifying credible local voices, those leaders in the communities who will put forward information in local languages in ways that are credible, and I think we need to continue to consider as we work with local communities this particular aspect of the challenges that we're facing. And I'll just say one thing on the question about meaningful dialogues, and that is that the U.S. does continue to be a global leader in this particular space, and will continue to be. And at the same time, we all recognize as you say, the importance of meaningful dialogues at multiple levels. But there's no country in the world that is doing more in this particular area than the U.S.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, I know we're getting to the end of our time. So, Angus, can you share a question from online? And then I think there were, oh, see, now there's more hands than there were before. I will mention, for those of you in the room, we're going to have coffee available just across the hall in the dining room, as well as the books. So we can continue the conversation in there. Angus, if you could share a couple questions from online, and then let's take, the woman in the blue shirt, and then David at the back. We're going to take a final round of questions. Please incorporate any final remarks you want to make into your responses, and then I'm going to hand it over to Aaron Sikorsky to close us out.
Great. Okay, so we have a question from Richard Lotspeak from Indiana State University, and this is for any of the panelists. Near-term security threats like the war in Ukraine and wars in the Middle East seem to override longer-term concerns like climate change. Are there good strategies for navigating through the near-term threats while making progress on the longer-term security challenges? And we have a couple questions on the connections between climate security and food and agriculture. So how are these connections playing out on the ground, maybe to Peter? And are these connections being interwoven into climate security frameworks? Great.
That person just needs to read the two books that we're talking about here today. Peter's book gives you a very on-the-ground view, and Sherry's book provides how decision makers are grappling with those challenges. Thank you very much. Okay, and then we're going to take, yeah, please.
Hi, thank y'all so much for coming out. My name is Gloria. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton, and I'm a data scientist servicing various DoD clients in the energy and environmental space. My question was really engendered by a lot of what y'all discussed today about unprecedented storm events, also the art of storytelling. I work in data, cold hard data, and sometimes I notice a tension between a lot of our government agencies looking backwards, for example, FEMA flood mapping processes, and what we now need in terms of looking forward, a process that might invite some of the newer types of AI models that sacrifice a bit of transparency for accuracy. I want to know if y'all have encountered tensions like this in your lines of public service, and if you have any general thoughts or insights on how our reliance on data as a society might help us navigate some of this climate security, but also help us get over some of the trust issues in the meantime.
Thank you. And then I think David in the back, you had a question as well.
David Mickle, Senior Fellow for Water Security at the Global Food and Water Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. Thank you all very much for these interventions, and to everyone here for their questions. My question circles back to some elements of the title of the event, Climate Security and U.S. Foreign Policy. Several of the localities, regions, countries most vulnerable to climate security risks, places like Mali, Yemen, Somalia, are mixed with areas beyond state control, or are areas beyond much U.S. foreign policy traction, even places where U.S. security forces have been asked to leave. What can U.S. foreign policy do to promote climate security in these areas where we seem to have little presence, fraught relationships, or little leverage to improve outcomes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a question on balancing sort of the long-term needs with short-term priorities like ongoing conflicts. The question about data. We tend to rely on data from the past to inform our future, but that doesn't necessarily work anymore in our current world. And so how do you overcome that? And then David's question about how do we leverage foreign policy in areas where we don't have much of a presence? And any final thoughts you want to share? So just a low-level ask. Okay, Sherry, let's start with you. You don't have to answer all of the questions.
Okay. Really, great question for the young woman at Booz Allen. You know, DOD and other government clients are working hard now to update their models with more relevant data because historical models like on flooding aren't accurate to predict the future. So the question is, how do you get there? You know, there are various, let's say, research and development programs that, like, you know, through the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, where I know they're updating like coastal flood mapping specifically for military applications. Some of them have to be tailored to particular unique needs, but other of them can be more general. But we do need to sort of be able to future cast in a responsible way. You have to know what the standards are, because if you're going to rebuild your infrastructure to a more climate resilient or climate proofed standard, what level, you know, Tyndall Air Force Base, which just got hit again in Hurricane Helene, is already in the middle of rebuilding after Hurricane Michael to withstand higher winds that ripped the roofs off the hangars for the F-22 back in 2018. So yes, we need to do that, and what we're finding is that unfortunately the flooding, the winds, the precipitation, all of it is beyond what we have predicted for the future. But those models are going to be super important. You know, urgent versus important, the question about how do you get the inbox not to drive what you do long term. That's why, you know, usually at the beginning of an administration, you have some opportunity to develop some long-term strategies, and hopefully those don't get completely overtaken by what's in the inbox every day, but that's always hard to do. And I think I'll stop there, but I see Rob Litvak came in the past. And Rob, you told me to write a book when I came here now 8 years ago. I finally did it. So there we go. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sherry. Peter.
Thank you. I mean, I have a sort of jumble of thoughts, which I'll get at as quickly as possible. I mean, I'm probably the least appropriate person on the panel to try and give a response to David. I mean, not least because you know this well, but it's not just the US that has like an unwillingness to kind of invest in a meaningful way in many of the kind of most climate and simultaneously conflict affected countries. And so I think what we need from the US government and peers elsewhere in the donor community is just a willingness to take greater risks and understanding that some of these kind of climate adaptation funds will kind of go missing. Some of the projects in those instances will perhaps be damaged in kind of renewed rounds of fighting, but that ultimately, if that's what it takes to kind of address some of the root causes of instability and insecurity and profound humanitarian suffering in the Yemens and Malis of the world, well, so be it. Just have to take a few more risks than policymakers are naturally and understandably inclined to take. On the hard versus urgent issue that as Sherry kind of very correctly phrased it, I think part of it is showing how all of the kind of macro level conflicts that we currently have in the world, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, each one of them has some sort of climate angle. I mean, for example, Sudan, the RSF, one of the two dominant antagonists of the conflict, has been able to kind of prolong the conflict in the way that it has, in part because of its very ready access to cheap, heavily subsidized Libyan fuel. The very fact that they have to kind of range their vehicles over these tremendous distances has ensured that supply of fuel, which they enjoy in a way that the Sudanese armed forces do not, is a tremendous strategic advantage. So just one of the smallish ways in which the kind of hard security issues that really do command our headlines are kind of intimately connected with this topic. And then the online question about the relationship between climate change and agriculture. I mean, there is no sector of society, no livelihood, which is as acutely vulnerable to climate change as agriculture. And that's why when we look at the vast majority of kind of conflict climate settings globally, it's the very fact that farmers are struggling mightily, often in places where there are few, if any, economic alternatives, places in which authorities either lack the wherewithal or in many instances the ability to offer the kinds of assistance that they could or should, and the fact that in a lot of these places agricultural conditions are deteriorating so rapidly that actually even effective targeted assistance and improved farming practices would not be sufficient to kind of gird these places for the tougher times to come, has ensured that, rural agricultural communities are kind of among the single biggest sort of nodes of climate-related instability and will very much remain so in the years to come.
Thank you, Peter.
I think when it comes to, and this will be like a just concluding remarks, trying to get all of these different elements and questions into it. I think if we take the Middle East as a case study, looking at the interconnectedness of all of these different factors, but particularly because we have active conflicts right now, with the war in Gaza and now in Lebanon, the whole question of, hard versus urgent becomes irrelevant because it's very clear that we're seeing these urgent issues come to the fore and crises explode because some of these policies were not taken prior to resolve some of these conflicts that are already existing. And so that goes to Peter's point of appetite for risk-taking, but it's also about political will. If you address these conflicts, and the United States has to play a critical role in leading these efforts, then you have an environment that is conducive to addressing all the other challenges that these communities are facing. Some of them are exacerbated by climate, and in many cases, the communities that are suffering because of wars and conflicts and the destruction of infrastructure, dams, water resources, etc., then also exacerbate the climate challenge for these communities. If you take the Abraham Accords, for example, that were normalization agreements signed between the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Israel as an example, they presented a vision for the region where some of these climate-induced issues, and I know, Peter, you're writing about this, as ways to collaborate. Israel is known to have had amazing technology when it comes to desalination and water management, but none of their neighbors can benefit from this technology if we continue to have conflict. And so I think these are the arguments that we have to continue to reinforce, that addressing these conflicts head on, and the US has to lead in this regard, will actually empower the United States and give more opportunities for the US and its other roles to address, together with partners in the Middle East or other regions, some of the other climate and climate security challenges that we face.
Thank you, Marissa. Anne.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I just make two final points. One is that as we look forward to the work that we need to do in the climate security space, addressing this urgent versus important is so critical. And that's one place where we have an advantage under the Global Fragility Act because we have a law that requires us to take certain steps and a strategy that tells us that we need to integrate the climate and the peace-building communities, increase adaptation programming in fragile states, collaborate with partners across the board on data and other ways, incorporate conflict dynamics into the work that we're doing in the climate areas and the effects of climate and localization. These are places where we will continue to have our focus because we are operating under a bipartisan law and with bipartisan support. And it is very hard in the U.S. government not to let the important or the immediate be overtaken by the urgent. So it is vitally important that we keep ourselves focused on full implementation of the work that we're doing, and that we do it in ways, to some of the points that were made earlier, where we can partner, not only with local communities, but with governments who can help us carry this important work forward. And that is and will continue to be a critical component of our work and a vital consideration in where we have opportunities. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ann. Thank you all very much for sharing your insights and answering the tough questions. We're going to turn now to some closing remarks by our friend and colleague, Aaron Sikorsky, who directs the Center for Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security and has been a leader in this space for a number of years.
Yeah.
Over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Lauren. We'll keep it very brief because I know we're already over time, but thanks to you and the Wilson Center for the partnership. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to you in this room who came out in the rain and everyone on screen today. I just wanted to end by kind of bringing it back to why this conversation is so urgent that we're having today, and why the participants on this panel and these new books in particular are so important in addressing that urgency. I mean, I think if you look in the news over just the past month, whether it's North Carolina or Poland or Nepal or Nigeria, right, we've had flooding disasters amplified by climate change that have cost hundreds of lives, billions of dollars, right? Militaries have been deployed in each of these places to respond to the hazards. And as Peter was mentioning, these kinds of disasters are undermining governance legitimacy, right, in a way that is really challenging states going forward. And I started my career as a counterterrorism analyst in the intelligence community. And if those kind of disasters had been caused by a non-state group, a terrorist organization, absolutely everyone in the US government would be galvanized to make sure they wouldn't happen again, right? And we'd be making the investments not only to respond, but to prevent in the future. And I think to get our government in the headspace where they need to adopt that mentality around these climate disasters, you need leaders like we see up here on this panel writing and telling these stories to move the needle, to push things forward. And that's why I'm so pleased with both Sherry and Peter's book, and Marissa, your work, and Ann's work as well, because I think, it's slow, hard going, but we need to move in that direction to be able to get to a place where we can manage this in the future. And so again, thanks to the Wilson Center and the panelists for this, and thanks to all of you for coming out.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
All right. Please join us just across the hall. We have coffee and can continue the conversation over there. And for those of you watching online, thank you very much. And thank you to our AV team for making this possible.